Mike, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
Yes, I'm doing well as well. My name is Alan Bacon. I'm the Social Innovation Director, Senior Director for the United Way, and I'm joined today by Mike. Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Mike Green. I am the Chief Strategist for the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness. And I'm also the co-founder of Scale Up Partners, which is a 10-year economic strategist consultancy company. And we are pioneers in the idea of inclusive competitiveness, which was the idea behind the National Institute.
Very well. This is our fireside chat. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we're going to dive right in if that's okay.
Okay.
So there's a convergence of crisis occurring right now across the country, in the city. I mean, COVID is out of control. The economy was temporarily shut down, and I mean the nation is polarized and really even paralyzed around issues of police brutality and race relations. I mean, where do we go from here?
Well, Alan, here's the challenge. We're witnessing a repeat of history. And you know the old adage, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And ironically, uh, the rise of Black prosperity in America occurred during the most tumultuous time of physical, political, and spiritual conflict across white America. And in that era, which I call the greatest era in US history, the conditions were established by white Americans specifically for the economic and political empowerment of Black Americans. Now, these conditions were deliberately undermined and destroyed by the enemies of racial equity and an inclusive American society. Those enemies targeted and destroyed every pocket of prosperity led by Black Americans. And we can learn from that era how to respond to today's crises and establish the necessary conditions for Black Americans to scale up our economic productivity through ownership and growth of successful businesses. Now, here's what I want. I want everyone attending to understand. We know that in the past, Black empowerment started with white leaders establishing the conditions needed for progress toward improving our quality of life. When we came off the plantations, we didn't have that power. It was white leaders that had that power. And so they changed the Constitution 3 times, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They invested in our economic empowerment through the Freedmen's Bureau. They helped us to build HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. It was our motivation, our innovation that was allowed to prosper through the policies and practices that white leaders established. So they created the conditions, and we began to actively engage in building the kind of innovation and prosperity that we needed at that time. Now, I say this because I want people to know that Black people have always been motivated and have constantly sought ways to improve our quality of life. It's the systemic impediments that have prevented our success. And yet we found ways to succeed, even when the Supreme Court ruled in 1896 that this nation was officially two Americas, one white, wealthy, and powerful, the other Black, poor, and powerless. And we built numerous pockets of prosperity where we had successful businesses. And our dollars circulated many times in those communities, right? Those were called Black Wall Streets. You know them, Tulsa, Durham, Harlem, they're all over the place. And they were deliberately destroyed by violence, through white riots and domestic terrorism, and they were systematically razed to the ground by urban planning policies with federal, state, and local governments colluding with private sector industries to destroy Black communities and our Black wealth and our progress. Now, that's where we were when Dr. King gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech in 1963, which we recently commemorated in DC. But, Alan, if you recall that speech, he didn't start with his dream, he started with his reality. The refrain right up at the top of that speech, 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, we're still crippled by the manacles of segregation and discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. He went on several refrains before he got to the point where he said, and so we come here to dramatize a shameful condition. That shameful condition, Alan, that shame, we don't teach children about that. And we don't teach them, we don't teach children about Dr. King's book, Why We Can't Wait, where he described the Negro Revolution, which is the title of his first chapter of that book, The Negro Revolution, Why 1963. And that nonviolent revolution, which is still going on today, made 3 specific demands. Now, we got to understand this. In order for us to move forward, we have to understand our history. Those 3 demands of the Negro Revolution was to end school segregation, end housing discrimination, and end banking discrimination and access to capital, which is what we're talking about today. So when we forget history or we bury it, we're doomed to repeat it. And that history has produced our current condition. So in order to improve our current condition, we got to start with our history. Now, that being said, I'm going to wrap up with this. Widespread generational poverty, it still afflicts us, right? Economically starved communities are all served by the worst quality schools in the richest nation in the world. There is no economic strategy for Black America. In the last decade alone, the nation's banks have been fined $243 billion for discriminatory practices, the same discriminatory practices that Dr. King was decrying in 1963. The systemic racism of the past, Alan, remains today. So we all inherited this segregationist society. I'm not blaming anybody. We didn't create it. We inherited it. The question we must ask today now is the same question that Dr. King asked in his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or community? And to build that beloved community that Dr. King talked about requires that we value Black lives enough to invest in them as a priority, starting with the same way that we started back in the greatest era, with public policy investments to create the best economic conditions for Black innovation and entrepreneurial success. So that's where we are right now, and that sets the tone for the rest of this conversation.
You definitely set the tone for the rest of the conversation. Let's talk about some lessons learned. I mean, you talked about history. You're talking about that, era being, one of the greatest, and you also spoke to, terms like Black Wall Street. We had our own version of Black Wall Street right here in Indianapolis on Indiana Avenue. So if that era allowed us the opportunity to build, prosperity, how does this era allow us the opportunity to preserve prosperity?
So that's a good question. and I love the question. Now, I want to tweak it a little bit, though.
Okay.
Because the preservation of prosperity requires that we first have a substantial stake in equity stake in the American dream of prosperity. And right now, we don't have a substantial equity stake in the American dream of prosperity. So we're really back where we were back in 1865 to 1872. That's those 7 years where they changed the Constitution 3 times. They impeached a white supremacist president. They built quality schools for our kids. We were protected from violence by police and white supremacists. We're in that era. I mean, we got to look back in that era and see what happened there in order for us to understand what we need to do today. Now, some researchers, economists, and politicians, they paint a positive picture of the progress of Black economies. And that gets propagandized to portray that some political leaders, it gets propagandized by some political leaders in order to say that the systems are fine. It's just the individuals that need to make better decisions. But when the State of Black America reports come out, the data always tells the same story. There's a ton of entrepreneurial activity among Black people, but the productivity is stagnant. And what I mean by that is in the last 40 years, in a 40-year span rather, from 1972 to 2012, Black entrepreneurship went from 187,000 businesses to more than 2.6 million. You cannot tell me we are lazy folks. You cannot tell me that. I'll show you the data. We are out there putting our money where our mouth is, taking the risk. We have hockey stick growth in entrepreneurial activity. But all 2.6 million Black-owned businesses, Alan, produce less than 1% GDP. That's exactly where we were when we were sharecroppers, producing less than 1% GDP. In 155 years since the Civil War, we have not moved that needle of GDP even 1%. We tend to focus most of our attention on supporting the growth of activity, which is good, obviously. But we have almost no focus on the impact of the outcome, which is economic productivity. So it's like we're training for a marathon with a bad strategy. We build up our collective entrepreneurial body and stamina to get onto a treadmill and run as fast as we can. And we look like we're doing a lot, but we're going nowhere. The result is displayed in the data, which strongly suggests that we need, Alan, an economic strategy, because the one that we had in the 60s is flawed. So let me offer you some data, okay? Today, Black home ownership is in the low 40 percentile, which is where it was before the Negro Revolution of 1963. Black business ownership, less than 1% GDP, despite hockey stick growth and activity of Black entrepreneurs. And Black employer companies today, out of those 2.6 million, we have about 124,000 employer companies having at least one employee. And they represent roughly 2% of the entire employer landscape. 80% of the employers across the country are white owned. If you look at Indianapolis, I'll bet you no one in Indianapolis can tell me what percent of the employer companies in Indianapolis are Black owned. Why? Because we're not taking those measurements. And if we don't value Black ownership, then we don't measure it. And we need to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. Real quick, wanted to thank our sponsors for the entrepreneurial track today. Indie Chamber, thank you. Goldman Sachs, Businesses Initiative, Second Muse, the Mind Trust, Kepper, J2 Medical Supply, and New America. Thank you once again to all of our sponsors for the entrepreneurial track for today. Mike, a follow-up question. So how would you detail and describe the condition of Black America's economy today?
Okay. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news.
All right.
All right. So the good news is that the economic strategy to increase Black prosperity and business growth in Indiana exists all over the state right now. The solutions to economic equity in Indiana and every state around the country exist already. In every sector of your state, Alan, there are regional development organizations and economic planners responsible for the SEDS, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies. Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies. It's been around for 50 years. It was set up by the EDA, the Economic Development Administration. They put money into it. The state puts money into it. Public-private partnerships put money into it. And they set the conditions for economic success and business growth in every region across the country. We're not in those plans, Alan. But the good news is that those plans do work. And we know that they work because the last 50 years, you can look at the skyline changing. You can look at the cranes on the building. You can look at the economic development. You can look at the gentrification. You can look at all the various different activities that have come out of those plans. And if you read those plans, Alan, you will find out what the next 5 years are in store. Now, in your city, your SEDS plans, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies plans called Accelerate Indy. Accelerate Indy. And it took them over a year and a half to put that plan together. And every year they update that plan. It's a 5-year plan to set the economic conditions. Alan, you got to be in that plan. Your leaders have to be at the table when those plans are being created and when those plans are being updated. And by the way, Black Indy has to know about those plans, study those plans, communicate to the community about those plans, and set the demands that Black Indian wants in order to be included in those plans, or establish their own plan and graft it into that plan. But at the end of the day, without a plan, you plan to fail. So those plans are receiving funding from federal, state, and local public-private partnerships. When we look at the state of, or the conditions of Black communities writ large across the nation, they're all the same. Economically starved communities, served by the worst quality schools that we can find in the richest nation on earth. They have the lowest per capita income. They have the lowest number of sustainable businesses. They have those businesses produce on average the lowest average of employment. And there's very little access to capital. So that's the conditions, ownership being key to racial equity. The conditions are not conducive to ownership. The conditions are set there so that as the kids grow up in these terrible schools and they graduate, then they come out with very low skills for low wage jobs. We're not being job creators, we're being job searchers. And we're not going to be able to get the high wage jobs because we're not preparing and equipping our kids to compete in a tech-based, globally competitive, innovation economy that is fueled by the fourth industrial revolution. And we don't even know what the fourth industrial revolution is, although it's accelerating the pace of obsolescence in the innovation economy. And we are trying to run to catch up, and we're not even at the bus stop yet, much less on the bus. So my point for your audience is that we need to look at the past 50 years of economic growth in every region across the state. And we need to recognize that the conditions were set for that growth and the nation to build a $21 trillion GDP, which is the richest in the world. So we know how to do this. We know how to build wealth. The question is, how come that same strategy hasn't been applied to the most vulnerable populations, Black and Hispanic populations, in the same regions where it's been applied to one segment of the population? This is not rocket science. So there's that. The good news is that we have those plans in place. The bad news is that we're not in them. Now, here's how we get in them. We cannot expect other people who have ignored us for 50 years to solve our problem. It ain't gonna happen. And we cannot expect the other team to give us their strategy for success and apply it for us. It's not gonna happen. We have to come to the table understanding this game and how to play it. We have to come to the table with our own strategy. And when everybody in the world today, after George Floyd and after Breonna Taylor and after now Jacob Blake is talking racial equity, we have to come to the table with the steps toward racial equity, with the goal, the measurable goal of what racial equity looks like in Indianapolis. And we have to prioritize business employers. In other words, if I want to move the needle of business employers 1% in Indianapolis, in other words, whatever Black employers represent as a percentage of the employer landscape in Indianapolis today, in 5 years, we should have moved that needle by 1%. In order to move that needle by 1%, we're going to have to invest in a heck of a lot of entrepreneurs. We're going to have to set the conditions to support them and their growth. And we're going to have to go upstream into the education sector. And we're going to have to make sure that those kids are prepared, that we're investing in their innovation and their value and their talent. Now, that being said, I'm going to give you 5 steps on how to address racial equity and make racial equity progress. You ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. So the 5 steps are, first one, we got to look back to the greatest era and reaffirm what happened there. Those changes to the Constitution. Do we still believe that Black people should be equal to white people as citizens in this country? Do we still believe that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 8 others since then still apply? Do we believe that we should have voting rights? Do we believe in these things? So we reaffirm that. And whatever laws you have locally on the books, let's reaffirm that. That's the first step. The second step, and we have to publicly reaffirm that. The second step is to reassess the conditions. We inherited inequitable conditions. We inherited a 20th century segregationist society, Alan. And all of these conditions that we talked about today, we have to reassess those conditions in measurable terms. So I have to know that when I go to Indianapolis and ask where are the best schools in this city, my real estate agent is not going to take me to the white side of town. She's going to take me to the black side of town. Okay, so we have to reassess. And then the third thing, we have to decide, are we okay with the segregation society that we inherited? If we are, then there's nothing to do about it. If we're not okay with it, then we have to decide that we're going to change it. And then keep in mind, this is not about the individual decisions. This is about the public policies that we control, that white people control. Are we going to change this society? And if the answer is yes, now then we move to the next level. And this is the fourth level. We're going to redesign those public policies. We're going to redesign your SEDS so that it prioritizes the most vulnerable populations, and the most vulnerable populations movement of their quality of life, of their ownership of homes, land, and businesses. These become a priority in those plans and a barometer of the success of whether or not you're moving in progress toward that, moving at 1% of employers in your region, moving the needle of ownership, so that we have generational wealth, so that we have sustainable economies in the most vulnerable populations. So we redesign. And then the final step is to implement. Once you have redesigned it, you now have a plan. You can now implement policies and practices with measurable outcomes. Those are your ways to racial equity. So anybody that starts talking to me about racial equity, I'm gonna ask them, where's your strategy? What's your plan? How do we measure it? How do we get there? What's your timeline? I'm going in because this is serious, man.
Yeah, Mike, absolutely. First off, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Your wealth of knowledge, history is very important to understand, and especially when it comes to sharing best practices, learning from things that have occurred in the past to help accelerate and engineer our future prosperity. So thank you once again for joining us. I know we'll be hearing more from you later on as well. Some plans are coming together, but thanks once again to all of our sponsors for today's chat, and we're signing out.
Thank you very much.